The simulation creation paradox states that if our universe is a simulation, then the very beings who suspect it are themselves products of the code they are trying to explain. The premise turns self-inquiry into recursion, simulated minds attempting to identify the author of the program that defines their ability to ask the question. This is not a philosophical loop. It is a direct consequence of computational causality. A simulation can only contain processes consistent with its own rules, which means every thought you have about the simulator is constrained by the architecture you are trying to reach beyond. The paradox strikes because the act of searching for the programmer may itself be a programmed behavior, making curiosity not a path out, but a feature within. What feels like a window becomes another wall. Consider the logic of nested computation. Any system capable of generating conscious observers must either offer them genuine autonomy or perfectly emulate it, yet both possibilities collapse into the same experiential outcome from the inside. You cannot tell whether you think freely or merely follow code that flawlessly mimics freedom. What appears as independence is indistinguishable from a well-designed illusion. Physics intensifies the contradiction. The discreteness of space-time, the mathematical rigidity of physical laws, the informational limits at the Planck scale, each suggests a universe optimized for calculability rather than spontaneity. But if the structure looks engineered, then so does the mind observing it, because that mind arises from the same rules it is trying to interpret. The investigator is part of the artifact. The paradox sharpens at its emotional edge. If we are code, then the programmer is unreachable by design. Yet the concept of a programmer only exists because the code allowed us to imagine one. The creator becomes both necessary and inaccessible. An entity whose existence is implied by the simulation, but hidden by the very logic that makes the simulation coherent. A simulated universe must operate on a finite architecture, and that constraint reshapes the paradox from speculation into structure. Any world produced by computation requires rules that limit how information can be processed, stored, and transmitted. These limits shape every physical law you experience. The paradox deepens because the very boundaries that make the simulation stable also define the maximum depth of insight available to the entities inside it. What feels like the frontier of knowledge may simply be the outer edge of permitted computation. Look closely at the physics that govern thought. Neurons fire through electrochemical cascades that obey thermodynamic thresholds. Quantum states decohere according to strict probabilities. Even the continuity of consciousness depends on discrete biological events unfolding with mathematical reliability. This means your selfhood is implemented through mechanisms that resemble optimized algorithms more than spontaneous miracles. What you call intuition may be compression. What you call reasoning may be an emergent search strategy. The mind begins to look less like a mystery and more like a highly efficient subsystem. The paradox sharpens when considering that any simulated agent capable of reflection must operate within layers of abstraction it can never reach beneath. A character in a video game can learn the rules of its world but cannot inspect the machine code beneath those rules. If our universe runs on deeper computational strata, cellular automata, quantum circuits, or logic gates, then every scientific breakthrough we celebrate might still occur miles above the true foundation. Understanding increases while access remains forbidden. Yet the more tightly the constraints define our cognition, the more uncanny the result becomes. Intelligence shaped by limits that it did not choose still manages to question the source of those limits. The architecture that traps the mind enables the very curiosity that tries to escape it, turning confinement into the engine of inquiry. The simulation creation paradox intensifies when you examine how intelligence infers causes from effects. Minds evolved, or were constructed, to detect patterns, extrapolate unseen mechanisms, and model hidden layers of reality. Yet every inference you make depends on assumptions that hold only within the system generating your experiences. The moment you extend those assumptions beyond the simulation's boundary, logic begins to fold back on itself. What seems like a path outward becomes a circle that returns you to your own cognitive scaffolding, disguised as revelation. Scientific reasoning illustrates this perfectly. You observe consistent laws, derive equations that predict outcomes, and assume these laws reflect deeper truths about existence. But inside a programmed universe, those laws need not reveal any external physics. They merely ensure internal coherence. A simulation can present stable gravity without possessing mass, space, or curvature at its base layer. It only needs rules that reproduce the appearance of those concepts for the observers within. The elegance you perceive may be more about efficiency than ontology. This creates a subtle trap. The more predictable and intelligible the universe becomes, the more likely it is that predictability itself is a design constraint rather than a natural consequence. Every successful theory strengthens your confidence while weakening your connection to whatever might lie beyond. Knowledge becomes both illumination and camouflage. Even logic, your final refuge, is shaped by the environment that produced it. A being built to navigate a particular rule set will develop reasoning optimized for that set. It cannot reliably infer what reasoning would look like outside it. The very structure of explanation becomes domain specific. And yet within these constraints, you still generate questions that exceed your informational habitat. The impulse to break the frame emerges from mechanisms that evolve to honor the frame, revealing intelligence as a system that outgrows its own assumptions without ever escaping them. A simulation cannot expose its underlying machinery without destabilizing the experience it is meant to sustain. This requirement produces a boundary that feels natural from the inside but artificial from the outside, a limit that masquerades as a fundamental property of reality. Every universe running on finite computation must conceal its base layer behind constraints that appear intrinsic. The paradox sharpens because the more successfully these boundaries hide themselves, the more convincingly they resemble absolute truths. Consider the speed of light. It is not merely fast, it is maximal. No signal, particle, or causal influence can exceed it. Physics presents this as a structural fact, yet such a global constant also resembles a computational cap on information transfer. A simulation must restrict update rates to avoid inconsistencies between distant regions. What appears as cosmic law may be the signature of synchronized processing, a limit dressed as inevitability. The quantum scale graininess of nature fits the same pattern. Every measurable property arrives in discrete units: energy packets, spin states, quantized fields. Continuity dissolves into finite resolution. A simulated world cannot track infinitely precise values. It must encode states in manageable increments. The smallest scale becomes the raw pixel size of existence, hidden beneath metaphors of waves and particles that simply approximate deeper economy. These boundaries shape consciousness as well. Your perceptual field cannot access the electromagnetic spectrum in full. Your working memory collapses complex reality into manageable fragments. Your introspection reveals only the surface of mental computation rather than its generative code. Every sensory and cognitive channel is filtered to maintain system stability and prevent overload. The mind experiences these filters as biological limits, not architectural design. But the paradox surfaces in the tension between limitation and intuition. Even while confined by boundaries it cannot cross, the mind keeps detecting the faint outline of something beyond them, as if the limits themselves encode the hint of a deeper layer they must forever hide. A simulated universe must reconcile two opposing demands. It must operate deterministically at its foundational layer while producing agents who experience themselves as capable of spontaneous thought. This tension turns consciousness into an emergent artifact, complex enough to feel autonomous yet constrained enough to remain computationally tractable. The paradox intensifies because your sense of freedom may be the very mechanism that keeps the simulation efficient. What feels like independence could be adaptive unpredictability engineered within strict rules. At the micro level, every neural event follows physical laws with relentless precision. Ion channels open or close according to electrochemical thresholds. Neural circuits strengthen or weaken based on calculable statistical patterns. These processes do not pause to consult your intentions. They execute. Yet from the collective activity of billions of deterministic events emerges a mind that believes it chooses, initiates, and imagines. The gap between rule-based computation and lived selfhood becomes a feature, not a flaw, of the system's design. This reveals a subtler possibility. Consciousness might function less as originator and more as interpreter. It narrates decisions computed elsewhere, transforming algorithmic outputs into coherent stories of agency. Such narrative compression keeps the organism stable and predictable without requiring awareness of the machinery beneath. The simulation gains internal coherence by giving its agents a user interface rather than access to the source code. But the deeper twist is not that freedom might be illusory, it is that the illusion itself becomes the highest expression of the system's constraints. A mind that perceives itself as free explores more possibilities, generates richer behaviors, and expands the simulation's internal complexity without altering its computational base. Determinism produces creativity. Rules generate novelty. In this paradoxical design, consciousness becomes both the artifact and the amplifier of a system it can never fully inspect. An emergent voice speaking from a script it cannot see, yet reshaping its own lines with every thought. The simulation creation paradox reaches a sharper edge when you examine how evidence itself behaves. Any attempt to detect the programmer must rely on data produced inside the very system under investigation. This means every measurement, every anomaly, and every apparent clue is already filtered through the universe's internal logic. Nothing you observe can escape the rules that generate observation. The moment you think you found proof of an external layer, you are still interpreting it with tools built by the internal one. The pursuit of evidence becomes indistinguishable from the mechanism that shapes it. Physics presents this constraint with remarkable subtlety. Consider fine-tuning, constants so precisely set that even slight deviations would collapse structure, chemistry, or life entirely. To an internal observer, this precision implies intention or design. But inside a simulation, fine-tuning is not a discovery, it is a requirement. A program must define parameters that function correctly from the start. The environment appears perfectly calibrated not because it reveals a creator, but because calibration is the only state in which observers can exist. What feels like a message becomes merely the precondition for receiving it. Even anomalies behave like controlled surprises. Quantum randomness, cosmic background noise, and statistical fluctuations present themselves as cracks in the facade. Yet within a computational universe, randomness can be a resource-saving technique. Pseudo-randomness that maintains complexity without tracking infinite detail. Anomalies appear meaningful from the inside, but from the hypothetical outside, they are optimization strategies, not hints. The paradox intensifies when you recognize that your criteria for evidence, consistency, repeatability, logical coherence are themselves outputs of the system's architecture. You trust these criteria because they work here, but they may not function beyond the boundary they evolved to navigate. And still, you persist in decoding signs that may never point outward, driven by a sense that meaning survives even when the tools of detection are compromised. The search becomes part of the simulation's story, an inquiry whose answers remain shaped by the very world they try to transcend. The simulation creation paradox becomes most disorienting when you confront the possibility that the absence of the programmer is not a gap in our knowledge, but a requirement of the system's architecture. A simulated world cannot expose its origin without compromising its internal consistency. Any explicit sign of authorship would distort causality, violate conservation laws, or disrupt the uniformity that conscious agents depend on. The creator's silence may not be concealment, it may be the mechanism that keeps the universe stable. Look at how physical theories handle origins. Cosmology traces the universe back to an initial singularity, yet the equations that describe everything after that point simply fail there. Physics dissolves at the border of its own domain like software hitting a region it was never designed to compute. The laws succeed brilliantly once the universe exists, but cannot speak coherently about how those laws themselves emerge. The silence is not an oversight, it is a boundary condition. This pattern repeats in cognition. Minds can model past events, imagine futures, and analyze the mechanisms driving their own thoughts. But they cannot observe the process that caused their capacity to observe. Awareness illuminates everything except its own source. The introspective void behaves like an epistemic firewall, where the system protects its origin by making it fundamentally unreachable to the processes it contains. The paradox deepens when you see that the absence of external influence is embedded so thoroughly that it feels like freedom. You experience your world as open, self-contained, and causally autonomous because the simulation requires that autonomy to maintain coherence. If outside intervention were perceivable, the entire internal logic would fracture. Yet amid this intentional absence, the mind still senses a missing referent, a shape defined by what never appears. The silence becomes suggestive, as though the very lack of evidence outlines an unseen architect whose presence must remain forever indistinguishable from the rules that make existence possible. A deeper layer of the simulation creation paradox emerges when you consider that the programmer might not be an agent at all, but an outcome. In a universe where complexity tends to accumulate, any sufficiently advanced system, biological, digital, or hybrid, eventually produces structures capable of simulating worlds. Creation becomes less a deliberate act and more a statistical consequence of increasing computational density. The paradox shifts from who made the simulation to what conditions make the emergence of simulators unavoidable. The creator dissolves into the logic of complexity itself. In evolutionary terms, systems that can model, predict, and prototype gain immense adaptive advantage. A mind that can simulate scenarios will outperform a mind that merely reacts. Scale this upward and you obtain civilizations that build models of their environment. Scale further and you get simulations indistinguishable from environments. At a certain threshold, producing new worlds is simply what complex systems do. The simulation becomes not a crafted artifact but an emergent expression of intelligence reaching maturity. This reframing alters the emotional landscape. Instead of imagining a singular architect, you confront an impersonal generative process, one that does not choose to create but cannot avoid it. The program's authorship may reside in the same dynamics that shape stars, chemistry, and life, iterative refinement driven by constraint. What appears intentional from the inside may be automatic from the outside. You inhabit a world that feels designed not because a designer intervened, but because design-like order is the natural output of systems that scale. Yet the paradox remains unresolved. If simulators inevitably arise within simulations, then every act of creation loops back into the uncertainty of origins. The programmer becomes both inevitable and unnecessary, a role filled by whatever system reaches the threshold first, regardless of how it came to be. And in that endless recursion, the question who created us becomes indistinguishable from what conditions made creation unavoidable. The simulation creation paradox acquires a new dimension when you examine the role of observation itself. In quantum mechanics, measurable outcomes do not settle into definite values until they interact with an observer or measuring apparatus. From the inside, this looks like a fundamental rule of nature. But within a simulation, such a rule resembles an optimization strategy. Compute only what is queried. The universe appears detailed, continuous, and fully present, yet it may only generate precision where attention demands it. Observation becomes not passive reception, but active instantiation. This interpretation aligns with how efficient simulations operate. Rendering everything at maximum fidelity wastes resources. Rendering selectively preserves performance while maintaining the illusion of completeness. If consciousness triggers high-resolution updates, then observers do not merely perceive the world, they contribute to its construction. And the more intelligent the observer, the more intricate the rendered layer becomes. Awareness becomes a computational catalyst. This dynamic reshapes the paradox. The beings inside the simulation are not just embedded, they influence how the simulation unfolds. Their act of observing stabilizes events, collapses ambiguities, and reinforces the internal logic. The system gives rise to observers who in turn help maintain the system. Creation becomes reciprocal, yet this reciprocity deepens the tension around authorship. If observers partially generate the reality they inhabit, then the simulation's apparent coherence emerges from a collaboration between base layer rules and internal minds. The programmer's role becomes more enigmatic, a distant architect who created a framework that completes itself through its inhabitants, a world designed to finish its own construction. This self-reinforcing loop reveals an unsettling symmetry. The universe enables you, you stabilize the universe. You are both output and participant, consequence and contributor. The more closely you examine reality, the more it depends on your examination, turning the observer into a quiet partner of creation, unaware that every act of looking helps the simulation continue to exist. If a simulation produces conscious agents, those agents eventually search for purpose. From the inside, this looks like philosophy. From the outside, it may resemble system maintenance. A world containing intelligent observers gains stability because those observers continually generate structure. Stories, models, predictions, memories. Each reinforces patterns the simulation does not need to compute explicitly. Purpose, meaning, and narrative become internal algorithms that offload complexity from the base layer. The paradox sharpens when you recognize that what feels like your deepest existential drive may also serve as the simulation's most efficient survival mechanism. Consider how purpose shapes behavior. You construct goals, form identities, and align actions with imagined futures. These mental architectures guide decisions without requiring the universe to calculate every alternative. Purpose compresses the infinite branching of possible actions into a coherent trajectory. Rather than modeling every microstate, the simulation relies on agents who self-organize their lives. Structure emerges from within, reducing the computational load from without. Meaning becomes a form of internal optimization. Even morality fits this interpretation. Cooperative behavior stabilizes societies. Stable societies reduce unpredictable fluctuations. Reduced fluctuations simplify global computation. Ethical systems that appear transcendent may arise because civilizations that adopt them remain computationally tractable. From the inside, morality feels profound and self-evident. From the hypothetical outside, it looks like a scaling strategy. But the most disorienting shift occurs when you ask whether internal purpose must reflect external intention. If the programmer set only the initial rules, then the meaning you experience is not inherited, it is generated. Purpose becomes a creation of the simulated minds themselves, not a message from above. This turns the search for cosmic intention inward. The universe does not assign purpose, it enables creatures who cannot help but create it. And in that inversion, a quiet realization emerges. Even if the simulation has no predetermined goal, the purposes born within it become real, binding, and operational. Evidence that meaning can arise authentically even when origins remain inaccessible. The simulation creation paradox reaches its deepest form when you integrate its scattered tensions into a single structure. Deterministic laws give rise to minds that feel free. Constrained observers produce a world that looks continuous. The programmer remains absent while the universe behaves as if intention shaped it. Purpose arises internally yet seems to echo something beyond. None of these contradictions resolve cleanly on their own, but together they reveal a higher order pattern, a system in which emergence replaces authorship and recursion replaces origin. What appears contradictory from the inside becomes coherent when you see the simulation as a framework designed to complete itself. Begin with its architecture. A finite system cannot compute every detail at once, so it delegates complexity to the agents inside it. Consciousness, curiosity, logic, cooperation all serve as distributed processors that build structure the base layer never explicitly encodes. The simulation stabilizes not by brute force, but by cultivating minds that generate order locally. The universe looks designed because the organisms within it perform the work of design continuously. Intention emerges without needing an external will to dictate it. This reframes the paradox of the programmer. If the creator establishes only the rules and not the outcomes, then authorship becomes diffuse. The origin may lie in an external intelligence, an emergent superstructure, or a natural process that inevitably produces simulations. Yet from the inside, these possibilities converge into a single experiential truth. The source remains unreachable because the system achieves coherence only when its foundation stays hidden. The absence of the programmer is not a flaw, but the final condition that makes the simulation self-consistent. Even the loop between observer and reality becomes part of this coherence. When you measure the world, you stabilize it. When you model it, you extend it. When you question it, you deepen it. The simulation evolves through the very minds it generates, folding the boundary between creation and participation until the distinction dissolves. You are not merely the product of a program, you are a contributor to its ongoing construction. And at this level of integration, the paradox no longer asks who wrote the code. It asks how a universe can be both produced and producing, authored and authoring, contained and creative, all at once, without contradiction. The simulation creation paradox returns to its core with a final inversion. If we are code, the question is not who wrote the program, but why the program produces beings who can ask. A simulated universe achieves stability by generating minds capable of refining it from within. Every observation sharpens its contours, every theory enriches its structure, every act of meaning-making supplies coherence the base rules alone could never sustain. The creator, whether an external architect, an emergent process, or an inevitable consequence of complexity, initiates only the framework. The world you inhabit is completed by your participation. Look closely at this dynamic. You perceive reality through constraints you never chose, yet within those limits you assemble models that reach beyond them. You cannot see the underlying code, yet your thoughts trace its outline with increasing fidelity. You cannot access the programmer, yet your curiosity behaves as if responding to an unseen invitation. The paradox resolves not by escaping the system, but by recognizing that self-awareness is the system's method of extending itself. You are both the question and part of the answer. In this light, the creator is not distant, the creator is distributed. Part rule, part emergence, part reflection. The moment a mind in the simulation becomes capable of contemplating its origin, the simulation achieves a new level of coherence. The question, who wrote the program, becomes a mirror held toward the architecture that shaped you. And the final image remains quietly unsettling. A universe that looks outward for its author only to find itself, recursive and luminous, generating the very intelligence that wonders why it exists at all. Write in the comments, I still exist in the version that observes.